The city did not fall quietly. Phnom Penh fell on a Tuesday morning, April 17, 1975, and the sound of it was the sound of 2 million people holding their breath. For weeks, the fighting had been closing in from every direction, the artillery getting louder, the food getting scarcer, the roads out of the city choked with the desperate and the displaced. The Lon Nol government, propped up by American money and American weapons, and very little else, had finally collapsed. A white flag was raised, and then, through the wide boulevards of the Cambodian capital, a different kind of soldier began to walk. They were young, most of them teenagers, dressed in black, carrying rifles, their faces expressionless. Some wore red and white check scarves around their necks. They said almost nothing. The residents of Phnom Penh came out of their homes and their shelters to watch, uncertain whether to cheer or to flee, uncertain what exactly had arrived. Many of them wept with relief because the shelling had stopped, because the war seemed to be over, because whatever came next could not possibly be worse than the 8 years of bloodshed they had just survived. They were wrong about that. In the chaos of those first hours, almost no one in Phnom Penh, and almost no one in the wider world, knew the name of the man who had just seized absolute power over Cambodia. He had been careful about that. He had spent years constructing an almost total anonymity, operating under a pseudonym, refusing photographs, keeping his identity from all but the innermost circle of his movement. Within a few days, orders began arriving from somewhere, from someone, that every resident of this city of 2 million was to take whatever they could carry and leave, immediately. The hospitals would be evacuated, the sick would be pushed out in their beds, the newborns would be carried in their mother's arms. The city was to be emptied, and the people of Phnom Penh were to march into the countryside, to the labor camps and collective farms that awaited them, to begin building the agrarian utopia that their new leader had promised. The man who gave that order was called Pol Pot, though that was not the name his parents had given him. He was born Saloth Sar, and the story of how a boy from a prosperous fishing village on a quiet Cambodian river became the architect of one of the worst genocides of the 20th century is not a story about ideology. Not really. It is a story about power, what a man will do to get it, what he becomes in the getting of it, and what he leaves behind when it is finally taken from him. This is that story. Before we follow Saloth Sar, Pol Pot, into what he did next, I want to take a moment to tell you about this channel. What we do here is tell complete lives, from the very beginning to the very end, told the way life actually happens, with all the contradiction and ambition and horror and consequence that real human stories carry. No summaries, no shortcuts, the full weight of a life, given the treatment it deserves. If that's what you came here for, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We put out new episodes regularly, and you will not want to miss what's coming. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, your city, your country, wherever you are right now. Every single time I ask this, the answers genuinely amaze me. These stories travel further than I ever expect. Tell me where you are. And then, let's go back to Cambodia. Let's go back to the beginning. The village of Prexbauv sits on the Sen River in northeastern Cambodia. A small place, a quiet place, a place of fishing boats and rice paddies and the particular sounds of rural life in Southeast Asia, birdsong and water, and the low hum of a world that moves at its own pace. Saloth Sar was born there, sometime around 1928. The precise date has always been uncertain, with official records settling on May 25th of that year, though some historians have argued for a date 3 years earlier. The 1928 date is generally considered more credible, based on how old he was when he first entered school. His father, Saloth Phem, was a man of substance. By the standards of rural Cambodia, he was wealthy. Over 20 acres of rice paddies, a small herd of cattle, connections that extended all the way to the royal court in Phnom Penh. His mother, Sok Nem, was a pious Buddhist woman who raised 9 children. Saloth Sar was the 8th. He grew up in comfort, in a household where enough was never a concern, where the family's name carried weight in the community, and where connections to the capital meant that opportunities were available that most Cambodian children could not imagine. In 1934, when Saloth Sar was perhaps 6 years old, the family used those connections to secure him a position as a novice monk at the Buddhist monastery of Wat Bodumvadi in Phnom Penh. It was a prestigious placement. The monastery was one of the most distinguished in the capital, and the young boy spent his first months in the city absorbing Buddhist teachings, Buddhist literature, and the rigid institutional discipline of monastic life. He would absorb the discipline. He would eventually discard everything else. The following year, 1935, he was sent to a Roman Catholic primary school, a colonial institution where the sons and daughters of the Cambodian elite sat alongside the children of French administrators. The French colonial project in Cambodia was, at its most cynical, a system for producing compliant intermediaries. Cambodians educated in French values, French language, and French administrative methods who would help run the empire and, in theory, come to identify their interests with those of their colonizers. The schools were part of that system. The boy in the classroom, learning French alongside the colonizers' children, was supposed to emerge grateful. He was not a distinguished student. The records are consistent on this point. Football interested him, basketball interested him, academic work interested him considerably less. He graduated from primary school in 1941, 2 years behind schedule. His family's connections smoothed things over, as family connections tend to do, and despite his unimpressive record, he was admitted in 1942 to a prestigious boarding school patronized by the Cambodian monarchy, where he remained until 1947. He continued, by all accounts, to prioritize sport over scholarship. In 1948, he enrolled in a carpentry course at the Technical College in Phnom Penh. For the son of a wealthy landowner with royal connections, this was considered something of a step down, a concession, perhaps, to the reality of his academic limitations. But then, in 1949, something changed. Privilege reasserted itself, and Saloth Sar was awarded a scholarship to attend an advanced engineering school in Paris. It was, on the surface, an extraordinary opportunity. It was also, as it turned out, the moment that set everything in motion. Paris in 1949 was electric with politics. The war had been over for 4 years, but its aftermath was still reshaping the world, and the French capital, with its cafes and its student unions and its tradition of passionate intellectual argument, was a place where ideas spread fast and took root deep. For the Cambodian students who arrived there in the late 1940s, Paris was also something else. It was a place where they could speak freely about the country they had left behind, about colonialism and independence, and the future of Southeast Asia, without the eyes of Sihanouk's government watching them. Saloth Sar arrived in Paris and discovered politics. He became involved in the Khmer Student Association, an organization broadly committed to Cambodian independence from France, and, more significantly, in the Secret Circle Marxist, a clandestine Marxist-Leninist group that met to read communist texts, argue about revolutionary theory, and plan for the day when Cambodia would be free to remake itself. The French Communist Party was at the height of its post-war influence in these years, actively supporting anti-colonial students from French territories and providing them with literature, with networks, with a framework for understanding their anger. Saloth Sar read Marx, or tried to. Later in his life, in one of his very few candid admissions, he acknowledged that he had never truly understood Marx's actual writings. The theoretical architecture of Marxism, the dialectical materialism, the economic analysis, the systematic critique of capitalism was beyond him, and he knew it. But what the readings gave him, what the meetings of the Circle Marxista gave him, was something different. It was the idea of continuous revolution, revolution pursued without compromise, without hesitation, and above all, without regard for its human cost. That was the idea that caught in him and stayed, not the philosophy, the energy, the permission. He spent 3 years in Paris before the Circle Marxist sent him back to Cambodia in December 1952, dispatched to assess the political situation on the ground. He arrived into a country in crisis. King Sihanouk had disbanded the National Assembly and was ruling by decree, struggling to maintain his grip on power as the pressure for independence from France intensified. By the summer of 1953, Cambodia was close to open civil war. Sihanouk's demand for independence from France was eventually granted by Paris in November 1953, a concession driven more by France's exhaustion in its grinding war in Vietnam than by any genuine regard for Cambodian self-determination. Independence had arrived. The question of what Cambodia would do with it had barely begun to be answered. The answer, in the short term, was another form of autocracy. In the 1955 elections, the first national election since independence, Sihanouk abdicated in favor of his father, formed his own political party, the Sangkum Reaster Niyum, and through widespread voter intimidation and outright fraud won over 80% of the vote, establishing himself as prime minister of what was effectively a one-party state dressed in the clothing of democracy. Saloth Sar and his Marxist-Leninist associates had attempted to infiltrate the opposition Democratic Party ahead of those elections, hoping to work from within a coalition government. Sihanouk's seizure of power made the strategy irrelevant before it had even begun. For the next several years, Saloth Sar existed in a kind of holding pattern. He taught history, geography, and literature at a private school in Phnom Penh. He remained active in underground communist circles. He married, in 1956, a woman named Q Ponari, who shared his political convictions and who would spend the next 2 decades at his side until the deterioration of her mental health, she descended into chronic schizophrenia in the 1970s, finally separated them. He was not, by any account, a man built for domesticity. He had one child, a daughter born in the mid-1980s when he was already approaching 60. But his true obsession was always the movement, the struggle, the eventual seizure of what he had spent his adult life wanting. In 1959, the Cambodian Marxist-Leninist underground formalized itself into a structure that history would recognize. Meeting in a room at a railway station in Phnom Penh, 21 senior members gathered in secrecy. The party was renamed the Workers' Party of Kampuchea. Tou Sameth was made General Secretary. Nuon Chea, who would later be known as Brother Number 2, was appointed his deputy. Saloth Sar was elected to the Bureau, third in command of an organization that had, at that point, almost no military capacity, almost no popular base, and almost no resources. He would not remain in third place for long. Tou Sameth was killed by the Cambodian government. The exact circumstances of his death were never fully established, but the consequence was clear. Within 2 years of Sameth's killing, Saloth Sar was elected as his successor. Nuon Chea stepped back from the active leadership. The man who would one day call himself Pol Pot, the man who erased himself and nearly erased his country with him, was now at the head of what would become the most feared revolutionary organization in Asia. The government crackdown that followed Sameth's death forced Pol Pot to flee Phnom Penh. With his wife, he made his way to a Viet Cong encampment near the border between Cambodia and South Vietnam. And there, in the jungles and the mountains, he spent the better part of half a decade. These were the years in which his character was formed, not as a thinker, not as an ideologist, but as a particular kind of leader. Those who knew him in this period described someone who was deeply difficult to read, enigmatic, self-controlled, introspective, capable of considerable personal charm when he chose to deploy it, and possessed beneath all of that of an absolute hunger for power and a readiness for savage violence that he kept carefully hidden. He suffered from chronic insomnia. His intestinal ailments plagued him throughout his life. He slept badly and thought constantly, and in the isolation of the jungle, with no moderating influences and no external checks on the direction his mind was taking, a worldview was crystallizing that would eventually express itself in mass death. In 1966, the party renamed itself again, the Communist Party of Kampuchea. It was Sihanouk, dismissive and contemptuous, who gave them the name that stuck, Khmer Rouge, Red Cambodians. Pol Pot initially rejected the label. His followers resisted it, but it entered common usage and stayed there, and in time it became the name by which history would remember everything they did. The party, through these years, was developing its own ideological character, separate from North Vietnam, separate from the Soviet Union, drawing instead on a version of Maoist agrarian revolution adapted to Cambodian conditions. Cambodia had no significant urban working class. The proletariat of Marxist theory barely existed. What Cambodia had was a vast rural peasantry, impoverished, largely illiterate, land poor, and angry. And it was this population that the Khmer Rouge identified as its revolutionary base. It was an ideology rooted not in Marxist economics, but in Cambodian nationalism and in the deep historical memory of Khmer greatness, the ancient empire of Angkor, which had once been the greatest power in Southeast Asia, whose temples still stood as monuments to a glory that the French colonial period had buried. That memory of lost greatness and the resentment it generated ran like a current through everything the Khmer Rouge represented. By 1967, the party had several thousand armed fighters in the jungles of northern and eastern Cambodia. In January 1968, they struck, attacking an army base south of Battambang and igniting in earnest the Cambodian Civil War. Sihanouk's response was the response of a man who had confused brutality with effectiveness. Indiscriminate bombing of the north and east, aerial attacks on villages in regions suspected of harboring guerrillas. The bombing succeeded primarily in alienating hundreds of thousands of rural Cambodians who had previously had little interest in the revolution and driving them directly into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. Every bomb that fell in a rice paddy was a recruitment poster. Every village flattened by Sihanouk's air force added names to the rolls of the insurgency. It was from this period that Saloth Sar began routinely using the name Pol Pot. The pseudonym became his identity. The birth name faded, and the man behind the name moved deeper into the shadow he had always preferred, leading a movement that was growing faster than anyone outside of it had yet understood. Then, in the spring of 1969, something happened that accelerated everything. American President Richard Nixon, already conducting an undeclared and increasingly desperate war in Vietnam, secretly ordered bombing raids into Cambodia to disrupt the supply lines running from North Vietnam through Cambodian territory. The operation was called Menu. It was hidden from the American public and from most of the American Congress. Its effects on Cambodia were not hidden from the Cambodians. Tens of thousands of Cambodians were killed in the bombing. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced. The raids fell primarily on the rural north and east, exactly the regions where the Khmer Rouge was building its base. And the result was the same as Sihanouk's earlier bombing campaigns, only on a far larger scale. The American bombs did for the Khmer Rouge what no amount of political organizing could have achieved on its own. Rural Cambodians who had never heard of Marx, who had no particular interest in revolution, who simply wanted to survive, found themselves fleeing into the jungle and into the waiting arms of the only organized force operating in that jungle. In March 1970, a pro-American coup deposed Sihanouk. Prime Minister Lon Nol established the Khmer Republic, and the king, the man Pol Pot despised above almost all others, fled to China. What followed was one of the more extraordinary political maneuvers of the entire conflict. In exile, Sihanouk was persuaded to align himself with the Khmer Rouge against the government that had overthrown him. It was a marriage of desperation and convenience, a Buddhist king lending his name and his legitimacy to a communist movement that would, once it had no more use for him, lock him under house arrest. But in the short term, it worked. Pro-monarchy Cambodians, who might never have joined a communist revolution, were willing to fight under a banner that included their king, and the Khmer Rouge's ranks swelled dramatically. By 1972, the rebel force numbered nearly 50,000. Lon Nol's government was structurally weak and morally hollowed out, dependent on American support that was becoming politically untenable back in Washington, riddled with corruption, and unable to build the popular legitimacy that might have made it worth fighting for. Year by year, the Khmer Rouge pressed westward. In April 1973, rebel forces reached the outskirts of Phnom Penh, close enough to see the city, before a massive American bombing campaign pushed them back. It was only a delay. Nixon's ability to sustain that bombing was running out of time, running out of political support, running out of everything. By March 1975, the Khmer Rouge and Vietnamese forces together had surrounded Phnom Penh with nearly 400,000 troops. The capital's population had swelled to nearly 2 million, 3/4 of them refugees from the fighting in the countryside, people who had fled ahead of the advancing lines and crowded into the city as though its walls could protect them. The government of Lon Nol had already fallen apart from within. The city was receiving its last American supply flights. The end was no longer a question of whether. It was a question of when and of what came after. April 17, 1975, the soldiers in black walked in, and the white flag went up, and the 2 million people of Phnom Penh waited to find out what the revolution intended to do with them. They found out within hours. The orders came from somewhere, from someone, that the city was to be evacuated. Everyone was to leave. Now. The hospitals were to be emptied. Patients still attached to their IV drips were pushed out into the streets. Surgical operations were abandoned mid-procedure. Newborns were carried out in their mothers' arms. The sick, the elderly, the wounded from 8 years of civil war, everyone, with whatever they could carry, was to begin walking out of Phnom Penh and into the countryside. The Khmer Rouge told people they were leaving for 3 days. They would return after the Americans stopped bombing. Because, the soldiers explained, the Americans were about to bomb the city. There were no incoming American bombs. The Americans had already left. The evacuation order was not a precaution. It was the beginning. Within weeks of taking Phnom Penh, Pol Pot had established his government at the Silver Pagoda, the opulent 19th century royal palace at the heart of the capital, with its floor of silver tiles and its gold and diamond Buddha, its centuries of royal history. The man who preached peasant revolution, the man who had grown up telling himself he spoke for the rural poor, settled into the most magnificent building in Cambodia and began, from there, to issue the orders that would kill nearly 1/4 of his own country. In January 1976, the country was officially renamed Democratic Kampuchea. The governing structure was a standing committee of Khmer Rouge leaders who referred to each other as brothers, the brother system, ranked by number, with Pol Pot as brother number 1. He served as prime minister. Sihanouk was installed in a nominal government role briefly, to prevent him becoming a rallying point for opposition. And then, when his usefulness was exhausted, he was removed and placed under house arrest. The pretense of coalition government lasted less than a year. The program that followed had a name, though it was more a concept, a ruling principle, than a policy in any conventional sense. The Khmer Rouge called it Year Zero. The idea was this: history was over. Everything that Cambodia had been, its colonial past, its monarchy, its cities, its class structures, its professions, its religions, was to be erased. Time itself was to be reset. The country would begin again from nothing, rebuilt from the ground up as an agrarian utopia of collective farms, a self-sufficient peasant state that owed nothing to the outside world and was subject to no foreign influence. Currency would be abolished. Private property would be abolished. Religion would be abolished. Cities would be emptied. The educated classes would be eliminated, not reformed. Eliminated because their education had contaminated them with the values of the old world. In their place would stand a new Cambodian, the peasant farmer, pure and collective, working the land for the common good. The model, though Pol Pot may not have fully understood or acknowledged this, was Mao Zedong's great leap forward, the attempt to transform China's agricultural and industrial output in a matter of years that had resulted in the death of as many as 50 million people in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Pol Pot knew about the great leap forward. He admired Mao. China would become Democratic Kampuchea's primary international patron, with Chairman Mao committing over $1 billion in aid and sending Chinese military and civil advisors to embed throughout the Khmer Rouge administration. What Pol Pot appeared to be untroubled by, what he may not have genuinely understood or may have understood and not cared about, was that the Great Leap Forward had been a catastrophe, that the model he was adopting had already demonstrated, at enormous human cost, that it did not work. The famine it had produced in China had not produced the agricultural revolution Mao had promised. It had produced mass death. None of this gave him pause. The forced evacuations from Phnom Penh and Cambodia's other cities deposited hundreds of thousands of people in labor camps in the countryside, where they were put to work on collective farms under conditions that bear no other description than slavery. The work was brutal. Dawn to dark in the fields, regardless of illness, regardless of injury, regardless of age. Beatings and torture were administered to anyone deemed insufficiently productive. But the most systematic cruelty was not the beatings. It was the hunger. Camp overseers had been given production targets. Those targets were wildly unrealistic from the start. Numbers generated by a regime with no understanding of agriculture, issued by men in Phnom Penh who had never grown rice and had no intention of learning. Overseers who failed to meet their targets faced punishment. So overseers falsified their reports. They filed production figures they had not achieved, sent rice upward through the distribution system that did not exist, and fed their workers less and less, deliberately, systematically, so that the gap between what the workers produced and what the reports claimed would not be noticed. People starved not as a side effect of the system. They starved because the system required their starvation to maintain its own internal fiction. And while this was happening, while hundreds of thousands of Cambodians were dying in the fields and the camps, Pol Pot was living in the Silver Pagoda, physically comfortable, largely healthy, surrounded by the luxuries of the royal palace he had seized, directing a revolution for the peasant that the peasant was dying under. The terror was not confined to the labor camps. The Khmer Rouge constructed a totalitarian apparatus of extraordinary ferocity across the entire country. Middle and upper-class Cambodians were targeted for their perceived connection to the previous government, or for being categorized as bourgeois. This, despite the fact that Pol Pot himself had grown up in affluent comfort, educated in colonial schools alongside the children of the French elite. The class war was directed with profound hypocrisy by a man who belonged to the class he was exterminating. Thousands of educators were executed immediately after the fall of Phnom Penh. Physicians were killed on class grounds. Doctors were by definition educated, and education was by definition contamination. The health system collapsed. Currency was abolished. Foreign trade ceased. Buddhism, the religion practiced by the vast majority of Cambodians, including Pol Pot's own pious mother, was savagely repressed. Monks were forced to leave their monasteries, to abandon their robes. Temples were desecrated or destroyed. The state declared itself officially atheist. Approximately 250,000 Cambodians of Chinese ethnicity were killed between 1975 and 1979, despite the fact that China was the regime's primary international patron. Perhaps as many as 100,000 Muslims were murdered. These were not purges driven by ideology, but by the oldest and most savage of motivations: ethnic hatred, nationalist paranoia, the Khmer Rouge's deep hostility toward any group that was not ethnically Khmer. And then there was S21. The facility stood in a converted secondary school in Phnom Penh, Tuol Sleng, which had once been a place of learning and became something almost beyond description. S21 was the regime's primary interrogation and execution center, operated by a commander known as Douche, who maintained meticulous records of every prisoner who passed through: photographs, confessions, lists of names. Between 1976 and 1979, as many as 20,000 people entered S21. Fewer than a dozen are known to have survived. The confessions extracted at S21 were almost all of them obtained under torture so extreme that prisoners would say anything their torturers wanted to hear, described vast CIA spy networks, Vietnamese espionage operations, conspiracies reaching through every level of the Khmer Rouge itself. The confessions were fabrications. The networks did not exist, but Pol Pot, whose paranoia had been growing since the jungle years, whose distrust of everyone around him was now pathological, read the confessions and believed them, or chose to believe them, which amounted to the same thing. The confessions fed the purges. The purges produced more prisoners. The prisoners produced more confessions. The machine consumed itself. At the killing fields, sites distributed across the country, the most significant of them at Chuang Ek, 15 kilometers south of Phnom Penh, mass executions were carried out. Bullets were used when available. When they were not, and the regime was always alert to expenses, victims were killed with sharpened bamboo, with scythes, with pickaxes. Some were forced to dig their own graves before they died in them. The killers were often poor farmers and peasants themselves, men who had joined the revolution and now faced the same fate as their victims if they refused to act. Children were indoctrinated into the regime's ideology and forced to participate in the killing. The children of executed dissidents and ethnic minorities were themselves murdered, the Khmer Rouge's reasoning being that it could not allow them to grow up and seek revenge. I have to stop here for a moment, because what I have just described, the deliberate starvation of workers to sustain a fiction, the execution of doctors and teachers, the murder of children, was all happening while Pol Pot lived in the Silver Pagoda, while he held government meetings and issued directives and planned the agrarian utopia. And somewhere inside him, he must have known that the utopia was failing. He must have known that the reports were false. He must have known that people were dying in numbers that the revolution could never recover from. So, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. If you had built a movement on the promise of liberation, if the one idea you had organized your entire adult life around was feeding the hungry and freeing the oppressed, and you discovered that your own system was the thing killing them, what would you do with that knowledge? Drop your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to know, because what Pol Pot did with that knowledge, what he chose in that moment and in every moment like it, did not just define his regime. It revealed everything there is to know about who he actually was. What he chose was to keep going. By the end of the 1970s, between 1.7 and 2.2 million Cambodians, out of a total population of approximately 8 million, were dead. 1 in 4, 1 in every 4 people in an entire country killed in less than 5 years. The United Nations and the Red Cross were already declaring in 1979 that Pol Pot's regime was effecting the near destruction of Cambodian society. Not the disruption, not the reformation. The near destruction. The end, when it came from the east, and it came quickly. The relationship between Cambodia and Vietnam had been deteriorating since the Civil War ended. Border disputes had simmered through 1976 and 1977, then boiled over. Pol Pot, whose hatred of the Vietnamese was an obsession of long standing, ordered retaliatory raids across the border. Vietnamese villages were attacked. Vietnamese civilians were killed. Vietnam's response was initially restrained. A brief military incursion in late 1977, then a withdrawal. But the message was unmistakable. The Khmer Rouge received it and escalated further. On Christmas Day, 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. More than 150,000 Vietnamese troops, many of them veterans of decades of fighting, first against the French and then against the Americans, swept across the border in coordinated columns. These were not the raw conscript forces that the Khmer Rouge had routed before. These were battle-hardened soldiers who had beaten one of the most powerful militaries in the world. The Cambodian army's resistance dissolved almost immediately. Northeast Cambodia fell by the end of 1978. On New Year's Day, 1979, the main Vietnamese forces began their advance on Phnom Penh. In the capital, the Khmer Rouge leadership understood what was happening. Senior members began evacuating, most of them heading for Thailand, for the border regions where they might regroup. Pol Pot himself headed for Battambang in western Cambodia, moving ahead of the advancing Vietnamese columns. The Silver Pagoda, the seat of his power, the palace of the revolution, was abandoned. On January 7th, 1979, Phnom Penh fell to Vietnam. A new government was established, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, headed by Cambodian exiles who had spent the Khmer Rouge years in Vietnam. For the Cambodians who had survived the genocide, the Vietnamese arrival was, in the most straightforward sense, liberation. The labor camps began to dissolve. People began walking back toward what remained of their homes. The killing fields fell silent. It seemed like the end. The Khmer Rouge, driven from power, its leadership in flight, its army shattered. It seemed like something that was already over. It was not over. 6 weeks after Phnom Penh fell, China invaded northern Vietnam. The Sino-Vietnamese War lasted less than a month. China suffered significant casualties and achieved limited military objectives, but its strategic purpose was clear. Beijing wanted to relieve pressure on the Khmer Rouge by forcing Vietnam to fight on two fronts simultaneously. The ceasefire came in mid-March 1979. The breathing room it created was enough. Along the Thai border, in the jungles and the hill country, the Khmer Rouge regrouped. With financial and military support from both China and, this is the part that deserves to be said plainly, the United States, Pol Pot attempted to reinvent himself. The Cold War logic that governed American foreign policy in Southeast Asia in 1979 was straightforward, if morally catastrophic. Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union, and therefore any force opposing Vietnam was, by definition, worthy of support. The fact that that force had just perpetrated one of the worst genocides of the 20th century was a consideration that American policymakers set aside. Pol Pot dropped the pseudonym briefly, calling himself Pham, Se, his father's name, and tried to rebrand the Khmer Rouge as a nationalist patriotic democratic front. The rebranding found an audience. In November 1979, the United Nations voted to recognize the Khmer Rouge as the legitimate government of Cambodia. Not a rogue state, not a genocidal organization. The legitimate government. The seat at the UN that belonged to Cambodia was given to the movement that had just killed a quarter of Cambodia's population. Through the 1980s, the guerrilla war continued. Pol Pot remained near the Thai border, issuing directives through intermediaries, dispatching his associate Khieu Samphan to represent the Khmer Rouge in peace negotiations. In 1981, he formally dissolved the Communist Party of Kampuchea, rebranding the movement as a nationalist entity to attract broader support. He claimed publicly that he had no interest in returning to power, that his only concern was the withdrawal of Vietnamese forces from Cambodia. Few who knew him believed it. His health was failing. In 1983, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system that required extended periods of treatment in Bangkok and Beijing away from the border. In September 1985, he resigned as military commander of the Khmer Rouge, citing both the deteriorating military situation — Vietnamese forces had pushed Khmer fighters into Thailand in 1984 — and his declining health. He stepped back from the foreground of the movement. His second wife, whom he had married after divorcing Khieu Ponari in 1979, was with him. Their daughter, born in the mid-1980s, was growing up in the jungle, in the border camps, in the only world the Khmer Rouge still controlled. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was ending, and Southeast Asia's political landscape was shifting beneath everyone's feet. Vietnam, under reformist leadership, began withdrawing its forces from Cambodia in 1988. The last Vietnamese troops left in September 1989. Peace negotiations opened between the various Cambodian factions: the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh, the royalist movement of Sihanouk, Hun Sen's faction, and the Khmer Rouge. The negotiations were long and complicated and frequently broke down. The Khmer Rouge refused to disarm. Sporadic fighting continued in the western borderlands. In 1993, national elections were held under UN supervision. The verdict of the Cambodian people was unambiguous. Sihanouk's party and Hun Sen's party together won nearly 80% of the vote. The Khmer Rouge, which had refused to participate, received nothing. A new coalition government was formed, and it launched military operations against the Khmer Rouge in western Cambodia. The organization, which had once fielded 50,000 fighters, was now reduced to a few thousand soldiers holding a narrow strip of border territory. Senior Khmer Rouge commanders were defecting. The organization was hollowing out from within. And then, in the summer of 1997, it turned on its founder. A rival faction within the Khmer Rouge, led by a commander called Tamok, a man whose own record of brutality was substantial, launched an internal coup. Pol Pot and his family were placed under house arrest. The details of what had precipitated the break were murky. There were reports that Pol Pot had ordered the killing of a senior Khmer Rouge official, Son Sen, along with Son Sen's family, in a fit of paranoid rage. But the consequence was clear. The man who had led the Khmer Rouge for more than 30 years was now its prisoner. In July 1997, the Khmer Rouge staged a trial. They put Pol Pot, brother number one, the architect of the genocide, the man responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 million people, in the dock, and they sentenced him to life imprisonment. The charges were not the charges that the world would have brought. The trial was not a reckoning with the killing fields and S-21 and the forced evacuations and the deliberate starvation. It was a factional maneuver, a piece of political theater conducted by killers who wanted to distance themselves from the man who had made them all monstrous. But it happened. The machine he had built had finally turned on him. By the time of the trial, Pol Pot was a wreck of a man. His heart condition was advanced. He had suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed, dependent on regular oxygen. His Hodgkin's lymphoma had progressed for years without access to adequate medical care. He was confined to a rudimentary dwelling in the jungle borderlands, the last remnant of the regime he had built. His daughter was nearby. His wife was with him. Outside the perimeter of his confinement, the country he had tried to erase was slowly, painfully, imperfectly putting itself back together. If you've stayed with this story to this point, thank you. These are the lives that should be told fully, the ones that require us to sit with their full weight and not look away. This channel exists to do exactly that, to give these stories the treatment they deserve, the length they require, the honesty they demand. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that button and turn on notifications. There are more stories coming that belong in your ears, but there is one more thing to say about Pol Pot, one final chapter. Before we get there, what do you think, sitting with everything you've just heard? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Was there any moment in this story where you think a different choice by any person involved could have changed what happened? I read every comment. Tell me what you're thinking. On April 15th, 1998, Pol Pot died. He died in the jungle, in the borderlands between Cambodia and Thailand, in the custody of the organization he had spent his life building, and that had spent its last year imprisoning him. The cause was listed as heart failure. He had never faced an international tribunal. He had never been extradited, never charged, never made to stand before the survivors of what he had ordered, the families of the 2 million dead, the people who had walked out of the labor camps, the children who had grown up in a country shaped entirely by what he had done to it. He died as he had lived for much of his life, in the shadow, unaccountable, unreachable. 6 days later, on April 21st, 1998, he was cremated in a Buddhist ceremony. The religion he had tried to exterminate performed his last rites. His ashes were buried near the Thai border. There was no state funeral. There was no monument. There was no international mourning. The world received the news of his death and moved on quickly, because there was nothing to mourn, and because the story of what he had done was still too recent, too enormous, too unresolved for a clean ending. Cambodia today carries the marks of what he built. The landmines, an estimated 4 to 6 million of them, still buried in the soil of a country the size of Missouri, were planted by multiple factions across multiple decades, but the Khmer Rouge's mines are among them, and they still kill. Children still lose limbs to ordnance planted before they were born. The clearance efforts continue, but the scale of the problem is staggering against the resources available to address it. The Tool Sling Genocide Museum occupies the building where S-21 once stood, the converted secondary school in Phnom Penh, where Douche and his staff photographed every prisoner, extracted every confession, and killed nearly everyone who passed through. The photographs are still there, thousands of them, faces staring out from the walls, men and women and children who entered that building and did not leave it. The museum receives hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. It is the most visited genocide memorial in Southeast Asia. At Chung Ek, 15 kilometers south of Phnom Penh, a Buddhist stupa rises above the mass graves of the most significant killing fields site. Inside it are more than 5,000 human skulls. It is an act of memory, of witness, of refusal, a refusal to let what happened there be forgotten, even as the world that did so little to prevent it has moved on to other crises and other catastrophes. The senior leaders of the Khmer Rouge who survived Pol Pot faced, eventually, a measure of accountability. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, a hybrid tribunal established in 2006, convicted Nuon Chea, brother number 2, and Khieu Samphan, the Khmer Rouge's head of state, of genocide and crimes against humanity. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Nuon Chea died in prison in 2019. The trials were slow, expensive, and limited in their reach, but they happened. They produced verdicts. They put the evidence on the record in a place where it could not be disputed. Pol Pot received none of it. He died 16 years before the tribunal that might have prosecuted him delivered its first verdict. He died, having faced only the kangaroo court of his own movement, sentenced by men who were themselves guilty of the crimes he had committed, for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. Cambodia itself remains a wounded country, not a broken one, but a country still working out what it means to exist after something like this. Hun Sen, who governed Cambodia for nearly 4 decades after the fall of the Khmer Rouge, was himself a former Khmer Rouge commander who defected to Vietnam in 1977. His long rule restored stability and produced real economic growth alongside persistent authoritarianism, the suppression of opposition, and a complicated relationship with the memory of the genocide, complicated by his own history, by the history of the party he led, by the sheer difficulty of building a future when so much of the past is still unresolved. The Khmer Rouge's final defeat came in 1999, a year after Pol Pot's death, when the Cambodian government finally eliminated the last remnants of the organization. He did not live to see it. He did not live to see his life's work conclusively end. He died in the jungle, in the custody of his former comrades, listening, if the reports are accurate, to a shortwave radio in a simple dwelling not much different from the jungle encampments where he had spent his years in the wilderness, forming the ideas that would kill so many. There is a terrible arithmetic at the center of Pol Pot's story. He killed approximately 1.7 to 2.2 million people, in a country of 8 million, in less than 5 years. Those numbers, stated plainly, are almost impossible to process, and that impossibility is itself part of the problem, because numbers that size stop being people and start being statistics, and statistics do not grieve and do not carry loss and do not wake up in the middle of the night and reach for someone who is no longer there. So here's another way to hold it. Imagine every 4th person you have ever met, your neighbor, your colleague, the person who served you coffee this morning, the child who sat across from you on the bus, 1 in 4, gone in less than 5 years, killed not by a foreign invader, not by a natural disaster, not by a plague, but by a government, by a policy, by the deliberate choices of a man who had persuaded himself that the elimination of a quarter of his own people was the path to a peasant utopia. And then imagine that the man who made those choices died in a jungle, never having faced his victims, never having been compelled to look at what he had done. Saloth Sar, Pol Pot, brother number one, was born into privilege and used it to reach power. He built his revolution on the bodies of the poor he claimed to represent. He erased himself so thoroughly that for years many of the Cambodians dying under his orders did not know his face. And in the end, the erasure was the only thing that survived him. His ideology is gone, his regime is gone, his party is gone. His revolution produced nothing, no utopia, no agrarian awakening, no liberated peasantry, only the graves and the landmines and the photographs on the walls of Tuol Sleng and the Buddhist stupa at Chuang Ek, and the country still learning generation by generation how to carry the weight of what one man's hunger for power cost it. The man who erased himself and nearly erased his country with him. That is his monument. That is all he left.